So, Prince William finally unlocked the compartment that everyone within the palace walls understood was there, yet no one wished to examine. And what it contained essentially carved a decisive boundary across the middle of Camilla's music royal trajectory. Not her standing, not her designation, but what that designation truly represents and whom it will touch once Charles stops being the reigning king. And truthfully, the most captivating element isn't even the directive by itself. It's the reality that Queen Elizabeth kept this concealed deliberately, intentionally, recognizing that her grandson would eventually need to deliver it to his own father. And she proceeded anyway. Consider, for a moment, the psychological weight of that determination. She didn't permit Charles to stumble upon it after her passing. She didn't hide it in some forgotten corner, expecting it would stay buried. She preserved it officially, kept it secure, and guaranteed it would emerge precisely when circumstances demanded it. That's not a reigning queen reacting to an emergency. That's a reigning queen constructing a future she understood would be complex long after she departed. If you're finding value in this examination of royal relationships, music, press that subscribe button for Crown Watch so you stay informed when we examine these turning points. Let's now explore what transpired in that encounter. William came through carrying a document, which immediately communicates this wasn't a relaxed family conversation. You don't bring documentation to a meeting unless you're ready to express something demanding evidence. He set it down, regarded Charles, regarded Camilla, music, and made absolutely clear this wasn't a talk disguised as obligation. It represented obligation finally cutting through a family exchange, which represents honestly a distinction the royal residence has obscured repeatedly throughout history that most observers lose the ability to recognize the music distinction. Yet William clearly could, and he had no interest in blunting the message anymore. Music. The directive contained in that document specified that Camilla's designation must be preserved as ceremonial exclusively, anchored to Charles's kingship, and never exercised as autonomous influence across the approaching monarchy. Music. Right there, you perceive the framework of what Queen Elizabeth felt threatened by. She wasn't attempting to demean Camilla. She was constructing a barrier between the current reign and the following one. Specifically, to defend Catherine's coming role before anyone might gradually erase the boundaries. And this is where matters turn genuinely compelling because the concept ceremonial is performing substantial interpretive work here. In monarchical contexts, ceremonial indicates, music. You remain in assigned locations. You perform smiles at appropriate moments. You participate in ceremonial occasions. You maintain respectability, yet you don't determine outcomes. You don't manage approval routes. You don't shape the arrangement of the approaching monarchy. And the directive explicitly specified Camilla's designation must never be wielded to control the standing of the coming queen. Music. Coming queen, signifying Catherine. Therefore, this was no theoretical constitutional conversation. This represented Queen Elizabeth regarding her grandson's spouse and deciding her function required safeguarding before any potential difficulties could emerge. That demonstrates understanding, yet it additionally conveys a fairly harsh conclusion regarding what she imagined could unfold without clear distinctions. Charles predictably felt shattered. His expression turned downward when William presented the record. He didn't respond in protest. He didn't counter. He simply gazed at the document as though his departed mother's authority had traversed the distance and settled directly onto his heart. And the reasoning makes sense. He invested decades shielding Camilla from condemnation, from audience hostility, from Diana's enduring presence, from everything. He ultimately brought her to a position of public endorsement, awarded her the designation of queen consort, directed the audience to abandon their open criticism, and now his own departed mother's concluding instruction reveals that acceptance contains parameters. That represents a music particular category of suffering. It's not refusal, it's constraint. And in certain respects, constraint proves more difficult to challenge since it appears justified. You can react with fury toward being expelled. It's considerably harder to react with anger toward being informed you're esteemed yet constrained. Music. Camilla stayed motionless as the significance became apparent. And music, believe that observation holds consequence because Camilla has endured generations of public examination. She's not someone who gets knocked off guard easily. Yet this wasn't a scandal report or a music approval measure. This represented the late reigning monarch whose endorsement she had worked diligently to receive, putting boundaries on her responsibilities in documentation. Her designation wasn't undergoing removal. Music. Her integrity wasn't being publicly diminished, yet its scope was becoming specified. Music. And that specification proved agonizing because it illustrated that the investment she'd made in achieving music recognition still didn't grant her say in what approaches. Then William secured the document slowly, music. And that motion apparently rang through the atmosphere in a manner that resembled one chapter ending as the subsequent one hadn't yet commenced. Music. He described the directive as recognized exclusively by a restricted group because everyone wanted to delay the family from encountering this moment immediately. Subsequently, he mentioned that one additional person required access to the reigning queen's instruction personally, absent intermediaries, absent mediation, absent diplomatic palace phrasing. Music. That individual was Camilla herself. Therefore William wasn't simply transferring a record to his father. He was guaranteeing that Camilla confronted immediately, which represents a decidedly contrasting situation from permitting Charles to absorb it individually and express it through his personal safeguarding, music impulses. William wanted her to receive it personally. That's a commanding maneuver, yet additionally a transparency move. Music. Nothing in between, no reduction, simply the directive in its authentic condition. Yet prior to Camilla encountering that music language, the royal residents had to recognize the circumstance regarding all individuals occupying the location. Underneath each royal designation rested music, a private suffering. And this exposure awakened each of them immediately. William bore the responsibility of succession. Charles bore the agony of fragmented commitments. Camilla bore the astonishment of a designation suddenly restricted by parameters. And Catherine, unspoken yet attentive, grasped that the reigning queen's concluding directive addressed not just what occurred. It concerned what awaited her. That's the element I think considerable commentary overlooks. Music. Catherine didn't pursue this. She didn't argue for it. She wasn't occupying the location demanding things, music. Yet she represented the individual the directive existed to safeguard. And that creates an extraordinarily hard circumstance for her. She can't acknowledge it with satisfaction. She can't even reference it openly without seeming like she's celebrating. Yet she simultaneously recognizes that the departed queen fundamentally extended beyond her duration to shield Catherine's subsequent place. That represents something challenging to manage discreetly. William recognized the atmosphere had shifted once his language escaped his lips. He functioned as something beyond a child communicating with his father. He embodied the approaching king safeguarding the structure of the monarchy prior to affection could alter it incorrectly. That's the fundamental contradiction of this complete circumstance. William wasn't functioning as a child who harbors hostility toward his step-parent. He manifested as the individual destined to acquire the crown and music requires it to approach unchanged. If Camilla's designation was permitted to expand beyond ceremonial, then Catherine's subsequent place could face disturbance into indeterminacy, music, prior to her duration had materialized. And if that transpired, the movement across kingdoms would experience interference from divergent demands for authority. Queen Elizabeth unquestionably perceived that circumstance and chose to block it. Charles grasped that jeopardy, yet he additionally grasped the harshness. He invested years defending Camilla from condemnation, from memory, from the lasting weight of historical injuries that continued persisting. Now he encountered the responsibility to consent that his departed mother's concluding intentions, music, transcended his individual attachment. He looked toward Camilla, and momentarily, his quietness expressed what his articulation couldn't manage. He appreciated her. He had selected her. Yet he additionally carried a crown constructed from guidelines more established than any confidential promise he had produced. That's the contradiction of kingship. You retain ultimate capacity in concept, yet in actuality, you're constrained through ages of convention and the explicit guidelines from the monarch preceding you. Camilla's suffering manifested in the most understated manner. She held the border of her seat, not theatrically, not audibly, yet with sufficient pressure that Catherine detected it. That specificity communicates substantially because it communicates Camilla was handling this internally, maintaining her exterior throughout the shift. She grasped the implication buried in the instruction. Her designation persisted in receiving respect, yet respect diverged from management. She remained capable to remain adjacent to Charles, participate in ceremonial functions, and demonstrate standing in gatherings. Yet, the monarch's directive positioned a barrier among her function and the music approaching monarchy. That barrier stayed imperceptible to the observers beyond, yet inside the royal residence, all recognized its formation. Catherine regarded William with quiet apprehension. Music. She comprehended his composed communication demanded additional strength than anybody acknowledged. Questioning Charles's inner circle signified penetrating a family fracture that stayed imperfectly reconciled, and the approaching sovereign grasped the reason he had hesitated before this interaction till now. Nonetheless, the directive recommended Queen Elizabeth had recognized this jeopardy substantially in advance compared to the family's preparedness to discuss it. The reigning sovereign music had responded from vision. She had responded from consideration and strategy. Subsequently, a royal representative transferred a secured package across the counter. The motion remained wordless, yet it struck the atmosphere like an admission. The record held multiple components, and the subsequent section didn't focus ahead. It focused backward. And as the family examined the departed queen's reasoning progressively, the circumstance transformed increasingly obvious that one overlooked happening had commenced the complete situation. All royal occurrences carry a happening that seems trivial afterward until heritage aims directly to it. Regarding Queen Elizabeth, that happening occurred throughout a restricted monarchy arrangement discussion when an uncomplicated ceremonial conversation transformed into a precaution. What occurred in that circumstance didn't become public. It carried out something substantially more precarious. It persisted concealed, fixed, music, and remained waiting. Now, a designation arrangement is fundamentally a restricted exchange concerning how royal appellations, positions, and ceremonial functions music should be incorporated in institutional usage. It appears unremarkable, yet it's truly where the authentic authority competitions emerge because whoever directs the terminology directs the interpretation. And this specific arrangement occurred, music, subsequent to a remembrance gathering when sensibilities were currently strained. Camilla's consultants had advocated for terminology that would position her designation nearer to regal management, nearer signifying comparable to the category of management typically preserved by the monarch by themselves. The reigning sovereign music participated without racing toward response. She maintained William close by, Charles occupying space, and music, an authoritative attendant observing each deliberate hesitation as the discussion tightened. Music. Initially, it resembled a vocabulary circumstance. Subsequently, it transformed into something divergent. Charles attempted to lessen the conversation, attempting to prevent the exchange from becoming damaging toward Camilla, yet the consequence arrived. One terminology choice. Coordinated monarchical command. The monarch, music, continuing functioning as a child under his mother's authority, grasped immediately that the terminology had transcended appropriate bounds. He tried to redirect attention back toward ceremonial aspects, yet the reigning sovereign had currently perceived the caution music, concealed beneath the refinement. William detected the transformation prior to somebody articulated it. His grandmother positioned her writing instrument aside without finishing her composition, and that subtle motion immobilized the area. Music. The prince remained conscious of it permanently. The monarch wasn't aggravated in an obvious manner. She remained chillier compared to that, firmer compared to that, since she grasped what was being examined. If Camilla's designation music could be expanded past admiration and into management, subsequently the approaching successor sequence could eventually become obscured through feeling, connection, and contradicting demands of authority. Music. Subsequently, the monarch proceeded following the arrangement concluded. She discreetly transmitted the directive that presently occupied the location at the center of the situation, characterizing Camilla's function as honored though restricted, music admired, yet never holding governmental reach. And here's what Camilla would eventually comprehend most powerfully. The record didn't originate from contempt. It originated from dread. Concerned that throughout a coming transformation, the kingdom could lose track of the distinction between the companion adjacent to the monarch and the inheritance that would eventually progress to William and Catherine. Charles wrestled with that realization since it represented his attachment as a governmental music difficulty. Camilla struggled since it represented her regard as temporary. And William would wrestle since the past arrangement had developed into the apparatus nobody desired to employ. Yet everybody currently comprehended required utilizing. Yet a concealed directive can remain wordless exclusively for so extended. When Camilla encountered it finally expressed aloud, the royal residence atmosphere fractured. The gathering commenced with formalities, yet it didn't persist that manner. No music. Attendant progressed ahead. No communications executive reduced the impact. Williams positioned himself across from Camilla with the reigning sovereign's music directive amid them, whereas Charles remained devastatingly motionless beside her. The quietness wasn't vacant. Music. It harbored generations of commitment, bitterness, devotion, and the single query everyone hesitated to articulate plainly. William initiated this exchange because governmental terminology had ultimately become inadequate. The prince grasped that once plenty of mediators occupied the area between hurt and accuracy. The music. Accuracy diminished with all careful phrasing. He demanded no administrative intermediate, no position communicating on account of an additional position, no mediator transforming music responsibility into anything gentler. Charles grasped the jeopardy of the selection instantaneously. Music. A limited monarchy exchange, signifying a restricted familial conversation where determinations are created prior to they become ceremonial, might either restore something injured or unearth something all attempted to conceal. Camilla experienced the stress prior to the opening critical declaration was, music, transmitted. She looked directly at William and questioned whether he thought she had surpassed proper limits. Her articulation music remained steadfast, yet the inquiry transmitted generations of appraisal inside it. The prince delivered the response with careful music attention. He described the directive wasn't written to embarrass her, yet since the monarch judged limitations were important, that terminology altered the setting. Limitations not dismissal, not isolation, yet a demarcation established so unmistakably that also self-respect couldn't traverse it absent repercussion. Charles replied subsequently carefully, yet with music, determination. The sovereign inquired regarding the reason his departed mother's directive had to be discussed immediately following the family group had weathered such substantial deterioration following Camilla had endured such substantial public condemnation following his individual authority had recently commenced to revitalize. He wasn't advancing ambitions. He embodied protection of the companion beside him. Yet William couldn't enable feeling to turn into authority. The prince grasped the crown continuing since individual attachment submitted beneath governance. Music. And that governance mattered since the approaching kingdom would eventually belong to him and Catherine. Music. Not regarding the unhealed perspectives of the existing reign. William articulated the vital declaration openly. Camilla's designation must not ever be exercised to manage the standing of the approaching queen. Music. The terminology arrived with piercing force. The approaching queen signified Catherine, the companion music, who would eventually occupy position beside William throughout the following reign's start. And the directive guarded her function prior to any music misunderstanding might produce around it. Camilla ultimately grasped the complete scope of what had remained undisclosed. Her ceremonial influence was not merely being quantified. It was being music restricted. Charles extended to the record, yet William didn't transfer it without hesitation. That moment communicated beyond refusal could possibly. The prince wasn't preventing papers from his father. He embodied preserving management of the instruction by itself, music. Since whoever retained it retained the authority to establish what Camilla's designation might music, and couldn't turn into. And that hesitation demonstrated the underlying authority competition under the designation. Since the question remained not currently what Camilla could be designated, yet who directed the inheritance's trajectory. Designations remain not exclusively terminology in a monarchy. They dictate entry, hierarchy, command, and heritage. The reigning sovereign comprehended that superior compared to anybody. Therefore, when her concluding directions were produced, music, it remained more than just harming Camilla's self-respect. It revealed the framework under the silken exterior. Music. Who might approve? Who might guide? Who might participate in the gathering, and who possessed the authority to direct what transpired subsequently. William grasped this, continued the component nobody requested acknowledged plainly. Camilla's designation maintained ceremonial aspects, esteem, and public respectability. Yet the directive divided presentation from executive management. Ceremonial signified the institutional tasks, welcomes, attendances, and acknowledgements that encircle royal presence. Management signified something substantially more hazardous. The capacity to impact choices, manage pathways, and shape how the arriving reign might be constructed. Music. The prince comprehended this distinction remained important since the monarchy might persist through unease. Music. Yet it couldn't continue blurred authority at the peak. Charles examined the terminology as though each phrase had been created in resistance to his existence. The sovereign invested generations proving that Camilla carried value beside him, and simultaneously he underwent obligation to recognize that significance didn't represent endless authority. An authoritative attendant recognized the duration he examined the manuscript lacking moving it. That quietude communicated the entire atmosphere everything. Music. Charles wasn't exclusively absorbing his departed mother's constraint regarding Camilla. He underwent receiving awareness of the reality that the prior sovereign had structured for a prospect wherein his affection might not be permitted to redirect the inheritance. Catherine sensed the expense in a substitute manner. Withdrawn from the strain of the gathering, music, she positioned a teacup, neglected, affected by recognition that her approaching position was experiencing protection via disagreement. The approaching queenly standing represented the location Catherine might eventually occupy beside William whenever he turned into monarch. And the directive shielded that location prior to doubt might collect around it. She didn't pursue opposition with Camilla. She remained without necessity of one. Yet the reigning queen's expression had positioned her within the middle of a conflict she had worked carefully to circumvent. William afterwards recognized the expanded comprehension. Particular royal employees had grasped adequately to continue wordless. They had prevented communicating music, the directive since nobody desired to demand Charles into choosing among the companion beside him and the ancestor who regulated prior to him. That avoiding had preserved equilibrium temporarily, yet it had additionally permitted confusion to increase. Currently ceremonial deliberations impacting Camilla encountered stricter examination whenever music. They contacted succession representation, approaching conventions, or Catherine's following position. Camilla might perceive those modifications prior to the community grasp them. She maintained honor, yet honor presently came comprising restrictions. And whenever those restrictions changed from confidential documentation into routine royal procedure, the opening impacts commenced to surface. The royal residence might take in a confidential argument, yet it maintained inability to mask the functional modifications that succeeded. And those modifications touched straight into Camilla's everyday royal presence. The implications didn't come with disturbance. It came with altered programs, eliminated signatures, slowed decisions, and entryways that currently didn't turn as readily as beforehand. Regarding Camilla, the embarrassment remained not obvious initially. It continued quieter compared to that. An orientation she stayed absent from, a ceremonial communication rewritten, a passageway where everybody presently comprehended, yet nobody dared articulate the reason. Camilla perceived the transformation prior to anybody communicated it to her. Music. She came expecting a arranged discussion, the category of limited royal exchange wherein tasks were organized, looks, music, were refined, and all designation was positioned accurately in its assigned location. Yet on this occasion, the gathering had been condensed. Her primary consultant remained absent. The program had become more focused. A worker, cautious yet distressed, communicated her the exchange had been transferred to a diminished arrangement. That single communication, music, contained the magnitude of a visible embarrassment, despite no visible statement had been expressed. William's workplace termed its specification, not discipline. The prince maintained the modifications signified the constraints established by the monarch, not a focused assault targeting Camilla. Nevertheless, royal employees grasped the fundamental implication. Ceremonial guidelines, the procedures that establish how royal functions operate at formal occasions, underwent alteration wherever Camilla's designation contacted predecessor depiction. Music. Predecessor depiction intended the emblems, terminology, and setup that highlight the approaching kingdom. That held consequence since, music, Catherine's approaching location couldn't experience vulnerability to gentle terminology, undefined management, or sentimental force from the contemporary period. Charles didn't respond to the transformation quietly. The sovereign shut the documentation forcefully in front of staff, and the noise traveled through the area comparable to a forewarning. He recognized what was taking place. Music. Restricted family difficulties had transformed into bureaucratic action. What had originated as a classified directive was presently reformatting agendas, consultations, schedules, and admittance. Charles had weathered public struggles previously, music. Yet this damage remained distinct since it came packaged in his departed mother's position. He, music, maintained capability to protect Camilla through devotion, yet he couldn't readily challenge the queen minus compromising the kingdom he had acquired from her. Music, Camilla discovered the subsequent impact in a ceremonial organizing guide. Her designation persisted in existence, honorable and unaltered. Yet, the background terminology had shifted. It no more indicated authority transcending Charles's authority. It no more permitted anybody to equate recognition with management. She realized the viciousness of that formula. Regarded enough to locate beside the monarch, confined enough to encounter notification that the approaching period didn't constitute her possession. William endorsed the adjustment silently following examining the directive by himself. Music. The prince didn't look triumphant. He appeared weighted. All approvals relocated him further away from the simplicity of remaining a child and progressively into the isolated difficulty of progressing into a monarch. Music. The emergency currently asked beyond simply guidelines. It asked a critical period. And that critical period couldn't arrive from organizations, documentation, or ceremonial refinements. After the entrances started locking, music. Merely a single exchange persisted equipped to prevent the group from fracturing irreversibly. Occasionally the kingdom persists not by means of ceremony, yet by means of two individuals talking genuinely whenever everybody stays absent. William and Charles had positioned on divergent positions regarding the directive, yet underneath the designation stayed a child and a grandfather transporting hurt in unique methods. In that limited instant, the disagreement surrounding Camilla's designation developed into something considerably more upsetting, a moment of acknowledgement regarding fondness, obligation, music, and the reigning queen's lingering presence. William initiated the exchange since the difficulty had extended too extensively to get handled via organizations. The prince desired no workers, no mediators, and no refined governmental language establishing distance amid him and his ancestor. Charles complied, though not since he felt prepared. He consented since the monarch comprehended that wordlessness currently inflicted hurt. The directive had transferred from categorized materials into existence. And presently ancestor and child had to encounter what it had triggered in them. A limited exchange in the governmental feeling signified exceeding simply two people remaining in isolation. Music. It suggested the circumstance prior to a household difficulty turned into a ceremonial determination. The remaining opportunity to express with genuineness prior to responsibility crystallized everything into bureaucratic action. Music. Charles appeared carrying the weariness of a person conveying equally crown and sorrow. He noticed the positioned representation of Queen Elizabeth positioned nearby. Music. And for an instant, the area seemed to exist to her beyond either of them. He recognized with uncommon gentleness that he imagined he underwent expectation to oppose his personal departed ancestor. The statement influenced William more intensely than objection could have. Music. The prince had anticipated objection. He had readied regarding authority, yet he stayed unprepared regarding the hurt in his ancestor's sound. Music. The type of hurt that rendered all governmental guidelines suddenly comprehensible. William answered with consideration since a solitary imprecise terminology might reignite, music, all issues. He clarified to Charles he wasn't pursuing to diminish Camilla. He was pursuing to shield the kingdom from uncertainty, music. The reigning queen had unambiguously dreaded. That maintained consequence since the kingdom wasn't merely the individual residing within it. It remained the connection of reliability that relocated the monarchy via individual authority to the music subsequent reign. If Camilla's designation underwent authorization to expand beyond ceremonial, Catherine's approaching location could encounter tension prior to William's authority commenced. Music. The prince needed his ancestor to recognize that this established not vengeance. It constituted security. Charles eventually absorbed what he had, music. Prevented communicating aloud. The directive continued genuine. It maintained binding quality, not since it remained simple and not since it protected everybody. Music. It originated from the reigning queen that had developed the existing kingdom by means of order, tolerance, and surrender. The king grasped he might contest the difficulty it resulted in, yet he remained incapable to simulate it carried absent credibility. William extended the exclusive kindness he maintained capability of offering. Music. Camilla might obtain recognition with dignity. Her designation might remain honored, though it might not restructure Catherine's approaching functionality. Anna. Music. Might not distort the sovereign's following phase. Ancestor and child achieved a tentative settlement. Not music. Comfortable sufficient to mend everything, yet adequate to halt the separation from turning into lasting. Yet restricted approval within the kingdom building signified zero until the exterior population experienced what had transformed and chose what it comprehended. By music, earliest hours, the narrative no longer remained limited to the household. It transformed into the possession of the nation, of media organizations, of periodicals, to audiences gathered at kingdom entrances, music, and to anyone who grasped that governmental designations are continuously merely cosmetic. The reigning sovereign's finishing directive had transferred from restricted heritage into community verdict, and a single publication transformed the entire situation into a nationwide spectacle. William recognized the restricted knowing amid Charles wouldn't endure limited for extended. The prince had embraced his ancestors' difficulties, yet presently the territory experienced expectation to embrace the outcome. A prominent periodical expressed the happening in a manner no kingdom statement might moderate. William Charles and Camilla positioned music underneath the declaration, the reigning sovereign's concluding demarcation. Those 5 terms impacted substantially since they created the situation understandable. The reigning sovereign had constructed a division. William had communicated it. Charles had acknowledged it. And Camilla currently had to function in it. Media organizations moved toward the exchange immediately. They portrayed the disclosure as a historic specification of Camilla's function, not as a removal, yet as a music constraint that modified the effective composition of the authority. That carried consequence since the audience consistently grasped governmental designations as emblems of recognition. Yet, this communication displayed they additionally functioned as applications of management. A designation might permit admittance, guide direction, and manipulate the direction following was constructed. Now, spectators underwent notification that the prior monarch had defended that direction additionally from past her authority, and William had become the individual compelled to carry out her finishing demarcation. Camilla underwent the community expectation prior to the kingdom finished its statement. She encountered the periodical publication at morning meal, turned the pages one occurrence, and positioned music it beside her beverage without completing her consumption. She didn't require anybody to articulate the disgrace. Her designation persisted honored, yet the territory music had presently recognized the demarcation surrounding it. The internal injury had developed into a community configuration. Regarding Charles, that constituted one additional impact. The sovereign music had endeavored to insulate her from experiencing diminishment to a disturbance. Yet, the specific directive that defended the kingdom had revealed her difficulty to the nation. Beyond the kingdom structure, a restricted group convened in tense motionlessness. Certain came out of admiration regarding the reigning queen's heritage. Certain came since they recognized change progressing in contemporary circumstances. A single mature individual articulated the terminology that transcended the disturbance. Music. The reigning queen comprehended it underwent requirement of defense. It remained straightforward, yet it transmitted the feeling of the morning. Audiences weren't exclusively reacting to Camilla. They experienced reacting to William, to Catherine, to Charles, music, and to the approaching kingdom suddenly rendered perceptible throughout a single-aged instruction. Kingdom representatives dispatched deliberately managed terminology, confirming recognition regarding Camilla alongside confirming that approaching arrangements would conform to the reigning queen's directive. Arrangement signified the sequence of position and significance in governmental existence. And presently that arrangement underwent publicly linked to Catherine's approaching function. Analysts comprehended the deeper disturbance. Catherine didn't pursue recognition. The prior monarch had supplied it. William merely revealed what underwent currently established. With a population presently cognizant the household couldn't persist concealed throughout wordlessness. The inquiry had transferred from what transpired inside the kingdom to what it designated regarding everybody influenced by the authority. And whenever the disturbance ultimately subsided, what stayed wasn't humiliation, yet the unpleasant resolution music reigning sovereign Elizabeth had kept behind. Fundamentally, the disclosure didn't damage the kingdom. It described music. The reigning sovereign's finishing directive didn't remove Camilla, embarrass Charles, or advance William ahead. It accomplished something more chilly, more thoughtful, and more enduring. It constructed a barrier amid fondness and management, amid designation and management, amid the companion beside the monarch and the prospect remaining beyond his authority. William recognized that the finishing evaluation never belonged to displeasure. Music. The prince hadn't come forward as a defiant child attempting to surpass his ancestor. He had come forward as the defender of a constraint the prior monarch felt the inheritance required. The inheritance in straightforward language remained not merely the material piece positioned regarding a reigning sovereign's mind. It represented the persisting management, accountability, and reliance that transferred from individual reign to the following. That identified the reason this moment carried significance. It defended the prospect from bewilderment, and it demanded the contemporary to acknowledge confines. Charles embraced the determination absent additional objection. The sovereign positioned the documentation back on the furniture and contacted its border comparable to he underwent expressing goodbye to a disagreement he couldn't extend to overcome. He had supported Camilla via commitment. He had brought her via circumstances that might have damaged less robust affections. Yet presently he absorbed the agonizing realization. Music, attachment might describe his protest, yet it couldn't eliminate his departed ancestor's instruction. The sovereign had devoted an existence demonstrating the household that commitment persisted initially. And presently that education had emerged to him in the most difficult conceivable manner. Camilla underwent the finishing in absence of disturbance. She didn't discharge emotionally, music, didn't pursue supplementary discussion, and didn't seek to transform recognition into resistance. She positioned independently following the entrance shut, wounded via comprehension that her designation remained respected, yet deliberately restricted. A governmental designation might create recognition, function, and community elegance, yet it couldn't mechanically create supreme management. Camilla recognized currently that embracing remained the route to preserve music, the recognition she maintained. Catherine's approaching situation underwent guarded, not by means of kingdom opposition, yet by means of the reigning queen's music, remaining intentional performance of discernment. William had communicated what the reigning sovereign had abandoned, and Catherine's location beside him remained not any longer susceptible to imprecise terminology or confined music influence. That represented the revelation underneath the disturbance. Camilla might occupy position beside Charles, yet she remained incapable to restructure what developed following him. This circumstance represented that the reigning queen's authority persisted organizing the kingdom subsequent to her transition. William illustrated he might protect its prospect. Charles compensated the psychological expense of commitment. Camilla discovered that recognition absent supreme management continued recognition, yet continuously not authority. That remained the finishing implication of the reigning queen's directive. The inheritance might express compassion, attachment, and recognition. Music. Yet whenever the prospect of the kingdom underwent danger, accountability possessed the concluding announcement.